Security is and should be the central theme of any worthwhile web application. As developers, we cannot ignore the threats our web applications receive every day from rogue actors. This section will put all of our previous learning together and will divert our attention from the usual model view and controllers to the identity model that comes along with the ASP.NET Core. Imagine having an e-commerce web application that accepts online orders, stores user information, and credit card information without any formidable security. I wouldn't buy anything from such websites. I'm sure the marketing pitch for security has been pitched so many times that the use cases have been demonstrated by so many fatal flaws in the renowned websites that I shouldn't really spend any time on this, as I'm sure you already understand how important security is. ASP.NET Core Identity is a very well-defined way of securing applications, web or otherwise. It takes the current security threat models, and it also has inbuilt security measures to protect our apps from the most known vulnerabilities. It won't relieve us of our burden of being aware of the current and emerging security threats posed on our apps by new developments by the malicious parties. It, however, provides the most common security measures for our app. We want our apps to have login and logout mechanisms so that one user simply cannot see the information of the other users, for example. People should not be exposed to the credit card information stored in our database either. Our users need to be able to trust us with these basic security steps. Rather than reinventing the wheel and developing something on our own that is not extensively tested and which might be prone to many vulnerabilities, ASP.NET Core Identity provides us a reliable way to implement the security measure in a matter of minutes. Let's dive in. Let's discuss the differences between authentication versus authorization. Authentication requires you to prove who you say you are, requires you to log in order to access a certain part of the application and access some information specific to your profile, based on a pre-agreed identity challenge response like username and password that you initially set up at the time of registration. Authorization, on the other hand, requires you that you must have the correct right to access a certain page that requires the right and privilege. Being a registered user is not simply enough to access the admin section of a website. Only an administrator is allowed to access the admin section and allowed to add or remove a certain product and promotion or view the sales record or the profit losses statement. Logging in is not enough. Someone will have to grant you a certain role level access. We will discuss role in a later section and implement it. Based on granted privilege, which means you don't have any control over this process. Someone else who has a privileged access must grant you the privilege. We will also implement this in a later section involving user management. There are many types of authentication available. We have the traditional cookies-based authentication that we will be implementing in the next video. We have Open Web Interface, or OWIN for short, OWIN-based authentication, where you don't have to worry about user management, unlocking the account, or resetting the password, etc., and let someone else take care of it for you. Intranet-based authentication for offices based on the Windows authentication, and cloud services like Azure that exposes the authentication mechanism like the OWIN for easier storage and access of data. We have chosen to implement the cookies-based authentication for our application as it is still the most predominant way of authenticating users. It also requires steps that are not easily guessed, and therefore it needs to be seen before doing it. Using OWIN is much simpler, and if you have access to Azure services, then I recommend that you take advantage of that. However, Azure cloud services are outside the scope of this course. Let's look at the steps needed for the identity setup. We need to ensure that the spnetcore.identity is present. Also, spnetcore.identity.entity-framework core needs to be present. We then add the identity middleware and configure the service in the startup.cs. We next add a class for the identity type. We call it site user. It can be any name, doesn't have to be site user. Next, we will set up the database from the command line so that it can store our user authentication information. We will create a controller for user accounts. Then we will create a registration view and action method. We will also need to create a login and logout view and their corresponding action methods. And lastly, the fun part will be testing our code. But before we get busy implementing all these steps for setting up identity, we have one simple step of setting up our project with an appropriate theme for the admin section and the login, logout, and registration page. In this video, we have seen authentication versus authorization, many ways to implement security, steps involved implementing the identity.